You are a teacher, you continue to be a teacher, you led a school, you moved into superintendency within a particular district, you moved into head office. But the truth of the matter is, you never stopped being effectively of the profession. And it was interesting that...
Others might argue with that, but...
It was interesting how you led that work and continued to lead that work. You've been front and centre within British Columbia's experience over the last decade in particular as you've moved to the top of the current league tables. Now, that's on a particular set of metrics, and I know that you'd be actually wanting to challenge those metrics as being not adequate to the new task. You've just taken on the role of moving into a superintendency, having been effectively Assistant Deputy Minister, where you are taking on this task in the field. Although the truth is the system hasn't let you go. They still regard you as being in the centre and in the field simultaneously. What we wanted to try and do with the British Columbia case was to place before us the potential creative tension between leading the current system while you are attempting to transform it. And how do you do that with the power of evidence? And your time starts now.
Was that what I was supposed to talk about? Okay. Thanks, Tony, and thanks for the invitation to come today and talk with all of you about the BC story, but I think it's also a part and parcel with the Australian story and the Great Britain story and the London story. I think we're certainly engaged in similar sets of inputs. I think our responses sometimes differ, but the same sets of inputs are happening across the world, and that was, I think, really important for all of us to think about. If I can figure this out, there we go. So Tony kind of set this up. I've worn a bunch of hats over time, and what I think I've learned about hats is you never take them off. You can't stop being a teacher once you've been a teacher. You can't stop being a principal once you've been a principal. You can't unknow the things that you've learned in those various roles. So in British Columbia, where the ministry are the bad guys, dark suit, face mask, Darth Vader kind of a thing. When I joined the ministry from being a school superintendent, I actually had a number of superintendents that wouldn't talk to me anymore because I'd gone to the dark side, literally. I had become one of them. And so trying to bridge those different worlds. Same thing when I became a principal and I was a leader in the teachers union in my day as a teacher. They said, well, you can't do that. You've just changed sides. And I've never really understood sides. And so I think that's part of the conversation of the BC story is about how we get away from sides and just get to the main and the key issues. So from my perspective, it's been really quite simple. I'll just say when I joined the ministry, George and I had this conversation earlier. The deputy minister phoned me up from my school district and said, do you want to come work for me? And I said, really? Doing what? And he said, let's make things better for kids. Can you do that? So that was my job for 7 years. Can you come in and make things better for kids? Kind of a cool job, best job going, which was open enough to do whatever I wanted and hard to be accountable for that because, not a lot of evidence-based at that point. So for me, it's really quite simple, and we talk in British Columbia a lot about this, sort of that learning fractal, and it gets to the evidence piece, but we try to simplify. So one of the key things we have tried to do over the last few years in British Columbia is simplify things. We often make learning and schooling so complicated when really there's some very simple things there. So a question that a teacher should be able to answer about every child in their classroom. How's that child learning? How do you know? And what are you doing differently to get different results if that's required? And I would suggest for every child, you want to do some things differently. We're not talking about are you meeting the standard. We're not talking about how many kids are here and how many kids are there. We're not talking about docking your pay. We don't do that in British Columbia. Just simply, how's the learning? How do you know? What are you doing about it? Every principal should be able to answer those questions of every classroom. I now, as the superintendent of a school district, need to be able to answer that about my school district. How's the learning in my school district, in my 26 schools? Do I know? It's hard to know if you don't spend time in schools and get out there and look around and work with teachers and work with principals and so on. When I joined government as the assistant deputy minister, effectively, as Tony said, my purview was all the things that you think ministries of education do, that's what I got to do. Curriculum, assessment, special needs education, Aboriginal education, French programs, distributed learning. That was all my stuff. Other people dealt with money and all that kind of stuff. That I'd agree with George, wasn't something I was already interested in. So I had to be able to answer the same question as a province. How's the learning? How do we know? And what are we doing about that? But you could draw it straight down to my experience as a teacher to get to, again, this is a student by student. Yang Zhao challenges us and he says, the tyranny of thinking about the all is a problem. You have to think about the each. So in British Columbia, our language quickly moved from how are all the kids doing? Because that's really a meaningless accountability or a score. It's how is each child doing? That's what matters. Together they'll roll up. In British Columbia, we've had the luxury of having, Michael, you might disagree, I'm not sure, but amongst the most fractious union relationship in Canada with our teachers' union. Absolutely awful. And that's gone on for about 40 or 50 years, irrespective of governments. It is what it is. And so when we started talking about some of these issues, if you came from government, you could not even start a conversation with the union. You couldn't even get in the same room to have the conversation. So that was a struggle from a government perspective. So we had to try to broaden the conversation. And in government, one of the theories of action, and my theories of action are sort of more non-theories or theories of non-action, things not to do as opposed to here's the exact thing to do. We have to get over the fact that you can't make people do anything they don't want to do. If you think you can, you're wrong. You get malicious compliance. You might, if at the best, get compliance, but just telling people what to do. One group of people can't tell another group of people what to do, especially when it involves things like learning. It's not just you have to drive these nails into a certain pattern in this to put this board up. That's one thing, but something as complicated as learning. One group just can't tell another group what to do. So government can't drive change. And that was a tough one for government to come to. You can't make people do it. You can enable it. You can create the conditions where it's far more likely. There's a lot of things you can do. Making and decreeing doesn't really work. We've tried that for a lot of years, doesn't really work. Change is done with people, not to them. Consultation's not enough. Well, one of the mantras that we had is, that I had in government was, I promise never to consult with anybody. Because I think consultation is often a pretty phony, fake process. That means you've kind of already made up your mind. You've actually got the curriculum all written and shrink wrapped. It's sitting in binders in the basement, just waiting to get trucked out. Oh yeah, one more step. I got to tick the box of consultation. So we promised we won't do that. We went to co-construction instead. We will start from the very beginning with every single group in this province, and we're going to do that the long way. And it was long and windy road. But I think we finally got to a great place. That's tough for governments to understand. As a assistant deputy minister, meeting regularly with ministers, the ministers would always say, so when will we be done? Another year? My God, not a year and a half. We're running out of mandate. So coming with a social license in our pockets was hugely important to be able to say to the politicians, this is what the unions want, this is what the parents want, this is what business wants, this is what we all collectively want. Therefore, it's okay to give us some time and space. Theory of action, kind of covered this. Traditional implementation models didn't make any sense to us because, again, our experience, maybe it's different here, our experience here is they don't work. You spend a lot of money and don't get much for it. You get a lot of angry people saying, man, you're going to make us do one more thing? Because again, it tends to be one group coming in and telling another group what to do. So we looked more at social change models. What we're talking about essentially in the transformation game is rethinking what school is. It's a cultural social shift. It's not a set of learning pieces that change. It is some of that, but it's broader than that. How do you get to deep cultural change? Culture eats policy for breakfast. Culture eats policy for breakfast. The best policies in the world, who cares? If the culture of the system isn't willing to embrace those and to take those on. We have stunning new curriculum in British Columbia, and I'll show you a slide of that in a second. I think it's absolutely brilliant. Under the heading of who cares? Unless people are going to do something with that. It's an incredibly enabling curriculum. But if the experiences that each and every child gets in their classroom with their teacher doesn't change, nothing's changed. We spent a lot of time and money for not much. So we don't talk as much about policy, we talk about culture. We use cultural change models to drive our thinking rather than traditional implementation models. There's more to learn from Greenpeace, or bringing a cloth, I don't know if it's a big deal in Australia, bringing a cloth grocery bag to the grocery store. How did that happen? There's lots to learn from those processes. The tipping point kinds of things. Moving from driving to enabling, you can't make. And our dialogue has really changed in the course of the last 5 years from us against them, government against teachers, principals and vice principals against teachers, everybody against teachers, to them and us, to now, and this morning back in British Columbia, an absolutely amazing event happened. I'll show you a picture of it in a second. It's just us. And really we've got to a place of we're all in this together. Now how we got to that place was through this. And I think it's something that the dinner last night was, I think, a piece of that here in Australia. But for us, it was a hugely, hugely important step. And it's not something we'd ever done or tried before. But this dawning realization that we have more things in common than those things that divide us. As educators and as a society, we have more things in common than divide us. So government, unions, schools, business, industry, parents, and business and industry, broad letters. What Ian did last night, the 5 to 10 minutes that Ian spoke last night, absolutely golden. You talk about social license from your business community for deep, fundamental change. Absolutely huge. We had never had those kinds of a dialogue going on. So we did that. We brought business leaders together. We brought educators together. We had the union presidents sitting next to the CEOs of various banks and businesses and industries. We found some fellow that would come in and help facilitate that conversation for us. And we just kind of had at it. What do we think about learning? What is it we want from our young people? And what we found out is we all wanted the same stuff. And the politicians sat quietly in the room and listened. And they came out of that, not shaken, but different than they walked in. They just recognized the power of the social license that we developed to say there is a huge mandate for change. The next piece is also hugely important. We realized that doing the same things in the same ways won't get us anything different. The same behaviors that got us where we are won't work. So we had to change how we interacted. We had to change how we worked together. And so we started around that social license, around that consensus with some of those key points from Andreas. It's no longer what you know, it's what you can do with what you know. And is our system, our current school structure, built for that? No, it isn't. It's based on knowing, not on understanding, not on applying. Yang Zhao challenges us a lot to think about diversity differently. To think that we don't need every kid to come out the same. That's not the game. Diversity is one of our greatest assets in British Columbia. We have an incredibly diverse, just like you do here in Australia, society. So we started to question the fundamental aspects of our system and then put everything on the table. So we were willing with the teachers, we were willing with business and industry, we were willing with parents to put all those things on the table and say, let's talk about what we want, not how we fix what we have. If we were building from scratch, would we ever come up with what we have now? Not a chance. All the things we know about learning, we wouldn't be in the same place if we actually applied all the evidence, all the things we know about learning. So we started at that very high level. And it didn't take us very long to start to drop in altitude. But we had to start there. Because then teachers would say, well, that's all fine and well, but our curriculum, like you want us to talk about understanding and applying, and you've got 92 learning outcomes in grade 2 language arts? Have you lost your mind? So we said, okay, that's something government can do. We have our hands on the policy levers. We can change curriculum. That's our task. We can't change what happens in a classroom. That's somebody else's job. So we all started to decide and think about what each other's jobs were and how it is all those things had to happen simultaneously to get anywhere. This is what our School Act says in British Columbia about the educated citizen. This is what teachers are required by law to produce. That's what me as a superintendent, that's what I'm supposed to be producing. Young people who? That's a great list. That list was written in 1988. Incredibly thoughtful and foresight, and lots of foresight. What our business partners said, our parents said, our teachers said, is, that's great. How about you do it? Culture eats policy for breakfast. So we've had that on the books since 1988 and completely ignored it since 1988. And continued to build trivial pursuit courses with trivial pursuit assessments and think that somehow relates to anything about learning. So getting a system that's focused on these kinds of things, focused on learning outcomes as opposed to just achievement scores. Yeah, one, they do relate, but it's not about getting higher scores in our reading assessment. It's about getting more and better readers. One does follow the other, but it's not, the game isn't chasing the results. It gets to all kinds of mischief. The game is improving the learning. So we were challenged to do that. Big difference between knowing a thing and understanding it. 3 key parts in British Columbia that we could all agree on. Don't forget the basics. Literacy and numeracy foundations. You got to read, you got to write, you got to be mathematically literate. Understanding and applying of rich content. The 2 new words, understanding and applying. Those 2 words change everything. Those require system change. And core competencies, what Ian talked about last night. What the other fellow on the panel talked about last night. Sorry, I forget his name. We need young people who can think, are creative, can work in teams, can demonstrate a variety of types of thinking, design thinking, creativity, those kinds of things. So we've put that into the curriculum now with complete agreement. This is a couple of month old version of 1 page of our curriculum. And it's now blue instead of brown. If you look at it online, it's changed colors. So this is Social Studies 4, just really quickly. And I can't point with this, but at the top, you see where it says core competencies. Every teacher of every subject of every child is responsible for teaching thinking, communication, and personal and social development. No longer can you say in British Columbia, yeah, but I teach math. Or yeah, but I teach physics. You might get at those competencies through the language of mathematics, or through the language of physics, or physical education, or whatever it might be. But the kinds of activities and things that happen in your classroom, the kinds of learning experiences for your kids, have to help you get there. Big ideas. 3 to 5 big ideas for every subject. What are those big things? And I apologize, it's too small for you to read, but you can go online. It's all sitting up there online. Big ideas. What our teacher said, tell us what's important and we'll do it. Don't hide it in 92 things. So we've identified 3 to 5 big ideas, things that kids need to understand, not know, deeply understand. That's not 4 projects. It's not 4 units. Fundamentally changes how we think about teaching and learning and what classrooms are like. Right-hand side, you see there is still some content, but it's more like 8 things or 10 things rather than 50 things. And next to that on the left is the kinds of things kids can be able to do. So in a pretty simple frame on 1 page, How do we want kids to be? What do we want them to understand? What do we want them to know? What do we want them to be able to do? 1 page. There is no more. No more binders. No more other stuff. Pretty simple frame. This is both liberating for teachers and completely terrifying. Because you can't say, well, I know my plan, my scheme of work is I just follow the outcomes, and on day 1 I do the first one, and on day 2 I do the next one. No more of that. So a lot of our work with teachers is helping them get their heads around what that looks like, because that's a fundamentally different game. It's the game that our teachers clearly identified they got into teaching to do, but our system hasn't allowed that to happen. So we have some great enabling policy, for example, curriculum, and then it's getting to how do we shift the system to allow that to happen. We did things incredibly collaboratively. So with our partners, right now in the Ministry of Education in British Columbia, for curriculum and assessment, we have 8 people. That's it. And they would do both. Last time we tried anything like this, we had over 100. So what does that mean is we had to use teachers. We had to use principals and vice principals. We had to reach out into the field to do that work. All we could do was help coordinate it. We couldn't even lead it. That's led to a curriculum. That's led to resources. That's led to the competencies. That's beginning to lead to assessment programs. That when the curriculum first came out, the Vancouver Sun went to the teachers president, put a mic in and said, tell us how much you hate this. Look, the government screwed you over again. They just dropped this new curriculum. And the president said, actually, we love this because we wrote it. We think this is the best thing since sliced bread. We need some money to help us implement it and all those kinds of things. Change the dialogue because we had to do it together. That has helped us build a far more by doing these kinds of activities, relationships with purpose, I think George said. It's not just feeling good. It's not just love, trust, and pixie dust. It's actually getting together and working together for some clear purpose, has led us to understand what that ultimate goal is. It's an iterative process. I wouldn't say we had the clearest picture when we started, because we had to work together. We had to go through a lot of process to get there. So a previous deputy minister that I worked with would say, we don't have a roadmap because no one's tried this before. But we know where the North Star is. We're beginning to define the North Star, and we all have a compass. And we're going to figure out how to get there. But we don't have a roadmap, and that's okay. It's the process. It's going through that matters. It's working through those kinds of issues. We now have at the bottom an innovation partnership where we have the Teachers Federation, independent schools, which those two have never, ever even been in the same room together. Government, Superintendents Association, principals and vice principals, collectively thinking about how they're going to spend some money to support our journey through this. Again, that conversation has not happened in 50 years in British Columbia. But there's clarity about the purpose. It took some time on the front end. Let me just boot through this. So, I'll end here. Not that we ever were in Kansas, but it's fun to think about. Fundamentally, the ground has shifted in British Columbia. We always were high performing. Our kids do well. They read pretty well. They write pretty well. Not if you ask our parents. If you ask our parents, we have one of the highest performing jurisdictions in the world, and arguably, Michael and I could debate one of the highest or the highest in Canada. But our parents have the lowest confidence in the public education system in the country. So it's starting to tell this new narrative, starting to tell this in new and different ways. Not just laying it all off on government. So in the past, this would all be government's problem. What are you going to do about it? How are you going to pay for this? What are you going to do? This is good, but yeah, not so much. We've changed the dialogue. So now if you asked who owns transformation, you'd get a bunch of different answers. And mostly it would be, well, we have a part of it. We're all responsible for all the kids, the moral imperative. We're all responsible for the change. I know that when I go out in my previous role as ADM or in my current role as superintendent and talk to a group like this, all the parents would leave and go find their child's teacher the next day and say, I just saw this guy in a black suit and he said this. Is there any truth to that? Does that make sense? What do you think? transformation, social change is built on those very personal interactions. Doesn't really matter what government says. What matters is what happens in a student's life experience and how that translates to parents. Who speaks for transformation? It's a good question. We all do. Very much an owned, very much a collectively owned issue. And who's responsible to who? That's different. Our nest of responsibilities has significantly changed. So, when we think about this, so let me talk about what happened this morning. And I can show you a picture, but it's really tiny, and you probably wouldn't care, but it's a kind of a cool picture. Is the Minister of Education standing at the podium? Next to him is the President of the Teachers Federation. That has never happened in the history of British Columbia. Ever. Standing there, independent schools on the next side, principals, vice principals, superintendents, parents, trustees, First Nations colleagues, all lined up, announcing a collective approach to how we help resource this shift for all of our kids, all of our teachers. And it's about $10. So it's a lot of show for not much dough. But we do that a lot in BC. And most of it's just in time, which doesn't cost the government anything. But anyway, it's another story. What matters is that was done collectively and has to be enacted collectively. Not a penny can be spent unless it's collectively decided on. Fundamentally changed the game. And we have a brand new minister, and I just got an email from him, and he was saying, yeah, maybe you were right, because he did a big gulp. I hope you're right, that this is going to work. Because government doesn't control the money. They put it out to the collective to control. We'll see. That's it. Thanks.